So, I'm not gonna lie. I was worried about this morning's message because I did not sleep well last night. I was like, why is the bed so tight? I was just squished. I just felt like I was just like turning between Claire, and I knew somebody had crawled in next to me. And finally, I woke up in the morning. 3 of the boys had crawled in bed with us. I was like, no wonder it was so tight. I was like, we're like, Abraham, what were you doing in here? He's like, I don't remember coming up here. I was like, yeah. But anyway, little sleepy this morning, but hopefully you're not. That's the important thing. I won't fall asleep. But anyway, we've been looking here in 1Peter, and we're going to be continuing on in 1Peter 2:10. But anyway, Peter was talking, we were looking at last week how he was talking about Jesus Christ, the cornerstone, and how Jesus Christ himself was the cornerstone of a spiritual temple that we're all part of, that we're all built into this this temple that God has created, that we all are joined together, and that we worship him and we bring him sort of in many ways that in the Old Testament they had priests who would bring him sacrifices. Peter was saying how we bring him sacrifices, spiritual sacrifices, that what we do is for God and to serve God, and that we're offering these sacrifices. And I was thinking, as I was thinking about this week, I was thinking, it doesn't have anything to do with anything, but I thought it was kind of funny. When I was younger, I remember I used to play with matches a lot. We dismissed the kids not for nursery, but for this is PG service. But anyway, I used to play with matches all the time. And I remember building this little pile of sticks, and I was sitting there burning them, and I remember thinking, I wonder if I should offer some ants as sacrifices. I thought, they did in the Old Testament. I was like, maybe it's something we should do. I didn't understand that Jesus Christ was our sacrifice once and for all, and I don't remember if I did, but I remember thinking it. But it's just amazing to know that we're a part of God's temple, that we are a part of his people, and that what we do is for him and in his presence, and that we're able to operate as we should as Christians. But we ended off in verse 9. It says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, and it says a holy nation, a people for his own possession. And I think we just can't grasp that enough. I think, we think about this and we're like, yeah, that's, informationally wise. How cool to know that we are God's chosen, a holy race of his people, right? And we think, oh, that's neat because, we used to think of the Jews as being that or something, but I just don't know if we grasp enough that God is saying, you are my people, my chosen people. You belong to me, like you're my people. And I just think it's just so cool as we're looking at this portion of Scripture. So Peter continues in verse 10, and he says, once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. He says, you weren't always like, part of being what he would call his people. And he says, now you people who didn't really have a name or a title, you're just people across the earth, he says, you're God's people. Those of us who believe and trust in Christ, he's like, we can call ourselves God's chosen, holy people that are his possession, his belonging, that we look out in the earth and we're like, we are God's people. We are his people. We are his chosen people for his possession, for his name's sake. It's like we are family of him, that he wants us to be known, and he wants us to know that we are God's people. He says, once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. And I think this is a little bit of a tricky thing because I know a lot of people, kind of struggle and mumble through this, wondering like, oh, what did God not love outsiders before? And it is a question, people say, oh, did he only offer mercy to Jews and things like this? And I just want to point out that I do believe that people like when the city of Nineveh, all those whoever they were, Ninevites, they weren't Jews, they weren't God's people, but when they repented and turned to God, I believe that they did find God. I think, people like Ruth the Moabite, who is the most outside, outcast, unpeople of God, if that's a word, she came, and I believe that she may have found trust in God. Certainly Rahab the prostitute, In the hall of faith in Hebrews, just a wicked outsider who just destroying the city of Jericho, she finds salvation in God. It's not as though there was never salvation for outsiders before, but we were not labeled as God's people. The Jews in general, I believe in many senses, they were a picture of what we would be in the future and how God would build his spiritual temple. But now we are known as God's people. The people of faith, we are the title of being God's people who have received mercy from God. So as we're moving forward, he says in verse 11, he says, beloved, he says, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. And I think this is interesting too, because as we think about the Jews, I think in many senses, he's using phrases that really bring us back to the Old Testament. But he says, the Jews always seem to be sojourners and exiles. It's like, man, if they're not in captivity here, they're in captivity there, right? And they're always traveling. They're always working their way to the land of rest, right? They're always on their way to that promised land. And in the same sense, even though the early church was really on the run, we are all he refers to us all as being, we're exiles and we're strangers on the earth. Really, when you are God's people, people who are not God's people don't really accept you all that well. It's not the coziest environment to live as God's people. But right now, we are exiles upon the earth. We're sojourners, meaning we're traveling across this earth, and we're waiting to be in God's presence the same way that the Jews sort of portrayed through their life. We're waiting for a day when there's a lot more comfortable environment for us. But he says, as sojourners and exiles, he says, I urge you to abstain from the passions of the flesh, and he says, which wage war against your soul. And I think, as we are, as he says, a holy nation. And he says, a royal priesthood. And we are his chosen people that bear his name, right? And as we're living like that, he says, I urge you to abstain from things that would be the passions of your flesh. And I think, we know in Galatians it talks about the deeds of the flesh being evident, sexual immorality, impurity, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, rivalries, fits of anger, drunkenness, all of these things that he says, these are what your flesh would desire and you want, whether it be that you covet and you're just greedy for things, or that you just like things that just, that's not a godly thing, but it's just pulling your heart away, right? And he says, these are the things, he says, I'm urging you, I'm begging you to get those things out of your life so that you can be a royal people of God, so that you can be a holy priesthood before him, so that you can be what you're really all supposed to be. It's battling against our soul. And he says that it's like it's warring against what you are supposed to be in God. And I think, I think there are so many people in churches that even in our church, in certain ways and forms, that I just think, I just wish so badly that each person would turn that corner. There are people who are like, it seems as though they've accepted Christ, but you're like, man, why don't you just live as you should live, right? What would get you to turn that corner to be like, I need to abstain from things I shouldn't be involved in, and I should live as a royal priesthood before God. I should clean those things out of my life, and I should go ahead and be what I ought to be. And you want so badly for each person to just make that choice. Just put those things behind you and just be as you want to be. And he says, I'm urging you, I'm begging you to make that change in your life, that you would do those things. And so, as we think of this, I really don't know where I'm at in my notes, but I know I wrote this down somewhere. But I was thinking of in like Exodus chapter 20, where God, he really made the people of Israel like his holy people, right? And he's like, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of slavery. And he says, you shall have no other gods before me. And he's like, you shall make no graven images. And he goes through and he gives all of the laws. And the people after he gives each law, they're like, we'll do that. We certainly will. Yes, we will, right? And then Moses goes up on the mountain for 40 days. And it hasn't even been 40 days, like not even 40 days. And they're like, let's make a golden calf and let's worship it and praise it for saving us from our slavery. And then it says they rise up to dance. And I kind of get the idea from when Moses comes down and smashes the stones, hearing what's going on, that it was not just to dance, but to just to live it up in any style of fornication or anything that any way they good and well pleased to be, right? It was not, they certainly weren't living as pleasing to God. They certainly weren't like, oh, we're God's holy people, we should live as holy people, right? That's us now. That's us. Like, we need to take good thought about what we are, because he has made us this. We ought to be that, right? It's not something where we should just continue in any sort of lifestyle that we may have continued in before. So he says this in verse 12. He says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles as honorable. And he says, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good works and glorify God on the day of visitation. And I think this is interesting too, because throughout the Old Testament, we would have thought, okay, the Jews are God's chosen people, and they called anybody who were not God's chosen people the Gentiles. But do you realize he's just put us into that place? He said, us is God's believing church. He says, we will go out among the Gentiles, meaning that we're supposed to look different than them. We're supposed to be living godly and holy lives, that we would look different than the Gentiles amongst us, right? And he's put us into that title of being God's special people who are supposed to look and act and behave differently. And he says, when you go out among the Gentiles, and he says, so that when they speak evil against you. And this is another thing, when you begin to take a stand for what is right, and you say, this is not right. I shouldn't do this, and I shouldn't be involved in that. And pretty soon people are like, you haters, I probably shouldn't even say anything that they might say. I don't know. It's just like, you know how it goes, right? You get labeled. He just almost takes the assumption that they're going to label you and call you wicked people. Are you wicked people? According to them, because they want to say that what you're doing is wrong, right? But he doesn't want us to give them any ammunition, that it wouldn't be the case. He says, so that when they say you are evildoers, he says, you may have taken a stand for God, and they may be standing up and spewing hate speech against you, right? But he says, I want your conduct to be good in those situations. And I didn't have a picture for today, and I was thinking, but Friday, I think I kind of got the opportunity. Again, here, if I can get the clicker to work, world's best dog. Who, what, me? Again, going through the trash, right? And she said, so as we're thinking, as people are saying, as my wife always says, she's nodding, terrible dog, terrible dog, terrible dog. Let's not prove the fact, right? Let's not prove the case, right? Let's not have anything to feel guilty about, right? Because they're going to label you as bad because you've taken a stand on God, right? But if we have not done what is wrong, this is what I think is incredible. He says, when they call you evildoers, he says, because of your good works, they may glorify God on the day of visitation. That maybe they've spewed all this hate speech at you, and they said, oh, you're this, you're this, you're this. And who knows what happened to you? Who knows what brought this about? But there comes a point in their life when they say, I was wrong because I see the godliness in them, and I see the good in them. I think, this is something that, you say on the day of visitation, and I can't even quite tell you what the day of visitation is. It could be the day that the Bible says that God visited the Gentiles to take a people for his own name's sake or something, or it could be on the day of the Lord's return that they happen to be ready because they saw in you that you lived as you were supposed to live, and you lived good, and your whole life they were saying, you person, you this, you that, and then they realized, I was wrong, and those people glorified God because you lived it out. You were what you were supposed to be, and I think it's an incredible encouragement to us that those people could literally change their mind, those very people. And so he goes on here and he says in verse 13, he says, and this is something that you can do to be someone who is above being accused of things, right? He says in verse 13, he says, so be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. And he says, whether it be to the emperor as supreme. And he goes on to talk about governors and things. And, you may think, oh, like, man, I don't, like, do we have to submit to every earthly dictatorship, right, or not? Hopefully we don't have an emperor, we have a president, but you get it. Whatever, he says, governing people, governing authorities, things of this nature. And you may say, they're not Christians, I don't need to listen to them. But he says, listen, don't wreck your image so that you lose the opportunity that they would see God in you, right? In a certain sense, there's bigger fish to fry. He says, be obedient to even the human institutions that are out there, and respect them and honor them as being there, as something that you should honor, so that when people are going to attack you, they're like, you're just bad, I don't know why, right? Because of God. Don't give them any more ammunition than they would be able, like, at the end of the day, you want them to be like, I can't really accuse you, right? Very similar to Jesus, right? That they brought all these accusations, but they all fall short because he was obedient, right? And he says to every human institution, and then he says in verse 13, he says, be subject for the Lord's sake. And you say, well, why would I be subject to these institutions? They're not Christian. God knows they're not Christian, but he says, why would you do it? For the sake of the Lord, so that they would see that you actually, that they could see the good inside of you, that you wouldn't be some rebel that they could pinpoint you and be like, no. He says, for God's sake, for the sake of him, obey the earthly laws, so that they can see that you are trying to be someone who is good and right. And then he says in verse 14, and he says to governors as sent by him to punish those who are wicked and to praise those who are good. And you may think, well, be it my president, be it my governor, be it my who knows what politician it is, you may say, they're only right 50% of the time. They punish the wrong people. They do it wrong. Like, But as much as is possible, understand that though they're not a Christian organization, as he says, think of them as sent by God. God set them up. God put them in charge. And he says, so I think the point is, you want to maintain an image of responsible obedience on this earth. And then at the core of it, even though you're standing for God and what is right, which you may say, that's wrong, that is wrong, right? But at the core, at the end of the day, you want to be clean of charges, right? You want to be clean of charges of disobedience, that you would have done what is right, that you would have been seen as good, that when all of the court cases were settled against you, so to speak, they would have said, oh my goodness, he was just good. That's all it was at the end. Although people hated him, at the end, he did what was good and right, and we can't pin an accusation truly against them. We need to make sure that we abide as much as we can, even though we may have disagreements and we may need to say certain things are wrong. As much as we can, we need to abide by the institutions that are in place. And this is the thing he ends with here in verse 15. He says, for this is the will of God, that by doing good you should put to silence the ignorance of foolish people. So in closing today, this is what he hopes. All of those people who are just spewing the hate speech at you, all of those people who say, oh, you're a hater, you're you don't like this lifestyle that God says is wrong, so you're just trying to do these things, and all of these people, and he says, he calls them foolish people. I don't even know how to describe it. Maybe I would say people who are not really dumb, but they probably haven't been churched as you have, let's say that. They haven't been taught as you have, right? They're foolish in their stupid stance of their ignorance. And they're blasting out against you. And he says that your good works, at the end of the day, that they would be silenced. Not because of some big fight blowout that you had, but when they would say, oh, these people through it all, They may have gone through mistreatment. They may have been attacked by this world. And look at how they lived good and godly lives. Like it's very rare that you would find somebody that you look at them and you just say there is just a pure love within them. There is just pure goodness within them. Although they may have had disagreements with this world, they were very honorable in their disagreeing. And at the end of the day, they're like, I just can't say anything against this individual. I was wrong. I was foolish. And that is who we need to be in this world. We need to be people that even the hate-spewing haters that we never thought would change would say, I was the one who was wrong. I can see the good in them. And he says this is the plan of God, that they would see it and be silenced. And even some of them would glorify God. And I think we just really need to be careful. I thought I was done, but I just had one more little comment I'm going to throw in there. I've been coaching flag football, and I shouldn't go with things that aren't in my notes. Hopefully this doesn't, I'm not talking about any particular person if you're watching. Anyway, I've been coaching flag football, and I sometimes have to get on the kids. I'm like, hey, I know your parents. I know you go to church. I know this isn't accepted in any environment. You may think you're in an environment where people don't notice, but let's keep it good and clean and right? Sometimes we think we get out into an environment where people don't know who we are, what we are. We need to keep it together no matter where we are. We need to have that godly image true no matter where we go and what we do, right? It's not just here in church, that people would see who we are for real and that testimony would stand and shine. So I just hope that we just really strive to be what God's people should be, and take it very, very serious. Let's go ahead and close in a word of prayer. Our God and Father, we thank you that you lived a life on this earth that you said what was right, but yet you were silent as a lamb to slaughter, to be humble and good and righteous and above accusation, above ridicule, above truly breaking laws, but that you only stood on God as your righteousness, and that you were hated for it, Lord. I just pray that you wouldn't I just pray that you wouldn't let us want acceptance from this world, and help us not to do foolish things that may achieve acceptance in this world, but instead help us to live as godly. And maybe that would bring some hate upon us, but or maybe it would lose some friendship for us, but help it to turn these people who we wouldn't think would turn to you to glorify you on the day of visitation, that they would be found as praising you for seeing who and what we were in this world. And I just pray this in your Son's name. Amen.